Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the committee's 32nd, I got it the wrong way round, 32nd meeting in 2019. Could I ask all people present, please, to make sure their mobile phones are on silent? The agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. The committee is asked to consider taking item 6 in private. This is to allow the committee to discuss a draft letter to the proposed government on the proposed National Islands Plan. Are members agreed? We are agreed. We'll move on to agenda item 2, which is the Agriculture Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Bill. Before we actually go any further, I'd just like to ask any members present if they'd like to declare an interest. I am going to declare an interest in that I am a member of a farming partnership. Peter, you wanted to say?
Likewise, Convener, I declare an interest as a member of a farming partnership as well.
Stuart.
I'm the joint owner of a very small registered agricultural holding from which I derive no income.
Thank you. Okay, well, this is our first evidence session on the bill, and we're going to take evidence today from the Scottish Government Bill team, who will provide information on the background to the bill and its objective. I would like to welcome Dr. John Kerr, the Head of Agricultural Policy Division, Dr. George Burgess, Deputy Director of Food and Drink, Ali McAlpine, Senior Statistician, Vicky Dunlop, who is the Bill team leader, and Andy Crawley, who's a lawyer for the Scottish Government. Now, Vicky, I think you're going to give a very brief introduction of no more than 3 minutes on what the bill is before we go into some questions. So, Vicky.
Yes, thank you, Good morning, committee. I thought it would be quite helpful to give the committee a little bit of background as to how the bill came about and why we need it. Essentially, we need the bill because when, or indeed if now, the UK leaves the European Union, the existing CAP rules will continue to apply across the whole of the UK, including Scotland, as retained EU law via the EU Withdrawal Act 2018. Without the primary legislation, Scottish ministers would not be able to make the changes to that EU retained law. In the report of May last year, Scottish ministers, the agricultural champions recommended a transition period of 3 to 5 years after the UK leaves the EU. This informed our approach to the Stability and Simplicity consultation, which ran last summer, in which the period of stability with little or no change to the existing CAP rules was proposed for 2019 and 2020, followed by a period of simplicity during which the overarching structure of CAP would be maintained, but with improvements made where possible. Analysis of the responses from that consultation is being undertaken. Was published on the Scottish Government's Consultation Hub in November. And the outcomes of that analysis are being taken forward by the Simplification Task Force, which we expect to report very soon, and the 2021 and 2024 Policy Delivery Group. All of that has helped shape the development of this bill. However, the timing has been driven by the prospect of leaving the EU, specifically the scope of the CAP from 2021. In addition, following recent developments of the laws around data protection, namely the Data Protection Act 2018 and GDPR, we decided to take the opportunity to update the legal mechanism by which Scottish Government collects agricultural data. And the current mechanism relies on powers under the Agricultural Act of 1947, therefore in need of updating. There was an opportunity to take a schedule in the UK Agricultural Bill which would grant Scottish ministers the necessary powers to do much of what is set out in this bill. However, as set out in the Legislative Consent Memorandum, which was submitted to this committee at the end of last year, the UK and Scottish governments disagreed regarding the reserved or devolved nature of 3 areas of the UK bill. As the committee will be aware, the UK Agricultural Bill fell when the UK Parliament was prorogued in October this year, and it was expected to be reintroduced following the Queen's speech, but the early general election has overtaken those events, and it will now be up to the incoming government to decide whether to introduce the Agricultural Bill and what it may include. As a result, the Scottish Government decided that the best option was to bring forward a bill to the Scottish Parliament, and that bill is Agricultural Retained EU Law and Data Bill, which we're discussing today. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Stuart, I know you want to come in. I would like to just ask the first question, if I may, and I'm not sure who's going to answer it, but on the 31st of October 2018, the Cabinet Secretary was in front of the committee and was quizzed by actually Maureen Watt at that stage regarding payments and the ability of the Scottish Government to make payments. And I just want to quote something from it, and you could perhaps then clarify why, in relation to that quote, we need the bill. So his quote was, on asked, and Maureen Watt's question was, the Cabinet Secretary will be aware that NFU Scotland is concerned there may not be a legal vehicle for delivering payments beyond the 29th of March 2019, which is when that was the exit day. For the record, can you give me your thinking on that? And Fergus Ewing was very clear, and his comments were, we are absolutely satisfied that there is no problem with continuing to make all payments that are properly due to farmers and crofters. And he went on to say that I am absolutely satisfied of that for very good legal reasons. As I have indicated, we will provide the committee with the legal advice in copper plate and detail. We never got the copper plate and detail, but at that stage, the Cabinet Secretary was clear that there was no need for a bill. What's changed? Who would like to go with that?
That if that's okay, Convener. So the position is that when we leave the European Union, the retained EU law will apply, and that will allow us to continue to make payments. However, as this committee in particular will know well, we have had to do an exercise of ensuring that the retained EU law functions properly. That's the deficiency fixing exercise, and colleagues in this room will have done a lot of work to allow us to progress those UKSIs necessary to make the necessary fixes. So that process should have come to a conclusion when we left the European Union, but a number of dates have come and gone, and we still haven't left the European Union, and there are one or two issues that internal colleagues within the four administrations are working together to ensure we are in a legal position to pay. So that's why Mr Ewing gave the assurance that he did at the time, which was true and remains correct, that because this bill does not perform that function, that function is a process of making sure the retained EU law works. What this bill does, and what Vicky sought to clarify just now, was it will make us able to make amendments to the EU law in order that we can bring in any changes through the simplicity and stability consultation that the industry is looking for, and to make any necessary changes once we've left the European Union.
Okay. I think the evidence session will be interesting today, because I think it makes some fundamental changes and gives the Scottish Government a whole lot more powers to vary payments in preparation maybe for changes which haven't yet been agreed. So maybe it's a question I'll have to ask the Cabinet Secretary as well, why things have changed so much. Stuart, you wanted to come in.
I just wanted to pick up on what Vicky Dunlop said about the three areas of disagreement between the two governments. And just to get on the record that the presiding officer of the Parliament has confirmed that this bill is within the legal competence of the Parliament.
Vicky, is that to you?
So I completely agree, and this bill doesn't touch on those three areas of dispute.
Right. That's the answer.
Okay, so we'll go to the first question, therefore, which is Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Thank you, Convener. I read the Agriculture Policy Memorandum that accompanies this bill, and in paragraph 64, I'll just quote from it briefly. During the debate on the 10th of January, the Scottish Parliament agreed to the appointment of a group to make recommendations on future long-term policy, and this Farming and Food Production Future Policy Group was announced at the Royal Highland Show in June. However, legislating for a long-term rural policy in this bill may preempt the Scottish Minister's decisions in relation to the recommendations of that group, and so negatively impact on it. And I couldn't agree more. I think that's a very good synopsis of why there's no policy within this bill, and some have referred to it as a technical bill. When I looked at the bill, though, in section 3, if you look at the bill at section 3, power to provide for the operation of CAP legislation beyond 2020, it says the Scottish ministers may by regulations, and can I just, I've spent, since I was first elected 20 years ago, very wary of giving power to ministers through regulations. They are necessary on occasion, but I'm very wary of it. It says, ministers may by regulations modify the main CAP legislation for the purpose of securing that the provisions of the legislation continue to operate, fair enough, in relation to Scotland for 1 or more years beyond 2020. So if this Section 3 is passed unamended, what it actually does, and this is our job to interrogate this bill, is give powers to ministers of whatever colour, whatever future government it may be, immense power by regulations to introduce this new system of agricultural support that this group is going to recommend to the current Cabinet Secretary. So my question is, Section 3 does not just do what it says in the policy memorandum, it gives massive power to a future Cabinet Secretary. So I'd like, perhaps, Vicky, could you comment why this is phrased in this particular way?
So, as you've correctly pointed out and acknowledged, that the bill doesn't set out the long-term future, which is going to be done by the Future Food and Farming Policy Group. But what the bill does do is enable Scottish ministers to implement the proposals on the simplicity and stability consultation. So whilst I acknowledge and accept what you've said, the power is for the short to medium term to enable the recommendations made by the agricultural champions.
It gives much more power than just that.
So it's kind of driven by where we're at. I don't know whether Andy wants to come in there.
Well, yes, I'm happy to comment on the scope of the power, given that's the concern that's raised. My view would be that the power is not as extensive as you think it is. The first thing I'll say about that is that the power is restricted to modifying the existing CAP legislation, the CAP law that will become retained EU law if and when we leave. So it's not a power to completely rewrite the Common Agricultural Policy, not even close to that. It's only restricted to modifying the existing legislation. So that's a substantial restriction on the scope of the power straight away. And the second thing I would say more broadly is that part of the purpose of this power is you might call it technical, but technical perhaps in a big way, and that is that the CAP scheme, as I'm sure members of the committee are aware, runs in phases, and that the current CAP scheme is the 2014 to 2020 scheme. So once we get to the end of next year, there are some restrictions in the CAP legislation which would cause difficulty if the intention is to continue to operate the CAP, which is the purpose of this bill. And therefore, the power is intended to be used to deal with those restrictions, so that if there are, for example, financial limits that need to be modified or replaced in order to ensure that the CAP can continue to function, then this power would allow ministers to do that. And if I could draw the committee's attention to subsection 2 of section 3, section 3.2, that's what that's about. It's about national ceilings, which are currently set under EU law. But if we are out of the EU, which is the only time at which this power would be available, then our ministers need to be able to deal with those issues.
Now, I understand what you've said, and I hear what you've said, but our job is to interrogate, as I say, the wording of this bill. And the wording of this bill makes it absolutely clear. It says Scottish ministers may by regulation modify, I agree with you, it says modify the main CAP legislation. But if we're out of the EU, there is no CAP. So it's what the CAP covers. It may modify legislation for the purpose of securing the provisions of the legislation continue to operate in relation to Scotland for 1 or more years. Now, if it had said for 1 or more years until either the intention, the Cabinet Minister said his intention is to have a new system by 2024, I would have no problem with this if it had said 1 or more years up to 2024, because it then would mean that the government of whichever colour it would be by that year would have to come back to Parliament with primary legislation that we could interrogate. This is a really important issue because we're looking at the entire public policy for agricultural support throughout Scotland. And despite what Andy Cole has just said, it does give power to ministers to do it without coming back to primary legislation, does it not? Could you just answer that question? It would give them power to do that.
I don't agree with the way that you've characterised the issue, so I don't think I do agree that the power could be used in that way. But as far as the wider issues around cap policy over the longer term, that's not really for me to say. I think I defer to colleagues from government.
I'll end, if I may, because it's really important, I think this. Just my last point. You can see that with everything, there are all different types of legal advice that can come forward, and often conflicting legal advice. And as I understand it, so we have a difference of view here on this. Would it not be more circumspect, let me put it that way, to remove the doubt, to remove it with an amendment at stage 2 from the government, to make the policy intention that you've got here, which is a good one, beyond doubt in the legislation? So what I'm trying to say to you is, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will be listening to all this as well, would it not be better to move this beyond any possible dispute?
John, yeah.
Thank you, Convener. Before I precisely answer that question, I'd just like to make a small correction to something that you said a moment ago about once we leave the European Union there is no cap. That's not the case because we have retained the EU law which will confer the powers of the cap into the UK legislation. So there will continue to be a cap, and the purpose of this bill is to allow us to operate that until such times as we bring in new primary legislation, which gets to the bull point that you're making about when that will be. So when we set out in this journey, we had anticipated leaving the European Union in March, and then again we anticipated leaving at the end of October, and we still have not yet left the European Union. So it's very difficult for officials and legal colleagues to come up with a robust point at which we could safely say that we will not need the powers within this bill, particularly the clauses that you're referring to. So for that reason, we haven't proposed to take the step that you're suggesting of an end date when the powers, because we don't yet know when we'll be in a position to have our new primary legislation in place.
I make one final comment, basically. But in my experience over 20 years, all governments with civil service advice, the job of the civil service is to say to government, well, we might need these powers because you might need them in the future. The point I'm trying to make is, as MSPs, our job is to make sure that the legislation that comes through is fit for purpose from our perspective.
And I guess you're going to push the Minister hard, or the Cabinet Secretary hard, when he comes in on that particular point. Stuart, you wanted to come in briefly.
Yes, I ended up with a tiny one that I note the defined terms. 1.2 main capital legislation refers to specific domestic legislation and gives a list of 6 points. So it's clear it's not the European stuff we're referring to. But no, the question I simply had in relation to some of the things Mr. Rumble says, and he's said this before, that the powers of the Minister are all subject to Parliament, because at 3.4 it says the affirmative procedure applies. So can I just have on the record confirmation that ministers may make no changes without the explicit consent of Parliament? And Mr. Crawley is nodding to say I'm correct. Thank you, Convener.
Yeah, and I'm going to park that as a comment because I think John Finney had expressed an interest in that as a line of questioning, so we may go back to that. Can I just clarify something? Stability and simplicity consultation completed. We haven't seen the results of that, so it's difficult to see how this bill reflects the changes that are recommended in that. Is the committee going to see that shortly? John.
So the results of the consultation were published, actually. So we did an analysis of the results. What we haven't yet done is brought forward the considerations of the Simplification Task Force. There's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, a lot of what the task force discussed fell into the scope of what we could only do once we have the powers necessary to make changes. So I know that the Cabinet Secretary spoke in front of this committee before about inspections and penalties. In order to change that, we have to think about the powers that we need to do that. So that would be something that would fall within the scope of this bill. So quite a lot of the discussion internally has figured around what we could usefully say now from the Simplification Task Force and what we should defer until we come forward with 21 to 24 proposals. Sorry,
I'm not sure that fully answers it, and I'm not sure you're going to. But Richard, I'm going to pass the next question to you.
As there are no details of any agreement between the Scottish and UK ministers on a unified policy approach to agricultural support, it's not yet clear to what extent there will be a common system for agricultural support across either Great Britain or the United Kingdom. So in some ways, we are going to have to devise a new system. Call it what you like, cap or no cap or whatever cap. So are the powers given to the Scottish Government via this bill intended to enable simplifications or improvements to existing cap schemes for a transitional period for approximately 5 years? With this in mind, are the provisions in this bill therefore time limited?
Who'd like to lead on that? John.
I'll take that. So, as we've discussed a moment ago in response to Mr Rumble's questions, the proposal is not to time limit the powers within this bill because we don't know how long we will need them for because of when we might bring in future primary legislation.
Because we don't know how long we'll still be in the EU.
Well, that is one of the factors at play, yes.
Because we don't know. And that's the problem. We don't know. And you guys are grasping in the dark, and people like us are criticising you for it, but what can you do? So will the policy measures to be introduced via secondary legislation be specifically time limited to the end of that transition period, if you don't know what the transition period is?
That depends on what we take powers to do. So there are a range of different things that we might want to do, and indeed we might choose to do very little. That would be in line with stability, and any simplification should limit the discussion to something which is quite small in nature. But the specific issues will determine whether or not it's appropriate to time limit those powers, and that would be something that we'd have to take on as we bring each piece of secondary legislation forward.
Small finishing question. Do you sometimes wonder that you're planning for something that you don't know what you're planning for?
Well, so
yes. Yes or no?
Well, yes.
Thank you. Thank you,
Jamie,
Convener.
you wanted to come in with a supplementary.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, panel. It's more of a technical legal question, and that's whether all this is predicated on the fallback of the EU Withdrawal Act to the UK bill, that post-exit EU retained law will have an effect in Scotland, and whether or not, if the UK withdrawal from the EU Legal Continuity Bill that was passed in this Parliament and subsequently challenged re-emerges, which one of those this bill would directly relate to, because it's still unclear, I think, as if there was a divergence in terms of the two governments with regards to the continuation of CAP, either during or post-transition, which of those two pieces of legislation this particular bill would be affected by, if at all, possibly directed towards the lawyer.
Certainly. So the drafting approach in this bill is based upon the 2018 Act, the European Union Withdrawal Act, because that's the piece of UK-wide legislation that provides for retained EU law. And as you correctly say, the first continuity bill was intended to do something similar. Now, I don't have any information on what colleagues might do about that bill and about that issue, but as far as this bill is concerned, nothing needs to be done in that respect. This will stand by itself, working with retained EU law.
Irrespective of whether the continuity bill re-emerges.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter, you've got the next.
Right, thanks. You know, the industry, the agriculture industry out there are desperately needing to see what kind of future support will look like. And we know this bill isn't going to give us the answers to that, but it does say that it will enable pilot projects to be run in order to test out new policy approaches so as to inform the development of longer-term future rural policy. So can we get any indication from the panel as to what the focus and purpose of some of these pilot projects might be, to give us some kind of idea of the way that the government is thinking about future support?
I'm pretty sure that's you, John. I may have got that wrong.
Thank you, Convener. So we are not yet at a stage to categorically say what the pilots will be, because we're still in the development stage, and indeed we're discussing issues with the Farming and Food Production Group that's already been mentioned already on Friday. So that work is very much ongoing and actively so. And some of the issues that were discussed by the Simplification Task Force are being handed on with specifically what we might usefully pilot in mind. So what might be helpful is to remind the committee what was set out in the debate in January, the principles under which we're operating, which were sustainability, profitability, simplicity, innovation, inclusion and productivity. So these are the sorts of things that we're pushing towards. And in the intervening time, we've also announced a climate emergency. So it is also foreseeable that Cabinet Secretary will wish to address some of the pressing issues that government has before it, in addition to those that were set out in the debate in January. So this is the framework that we're working within, and we're hoping to bring forward useful pilots that will help us to determine future policy. And the other constraint is something that is deliverable within the time frame allowed.
So when are we likely to have some idea what these pilots will look like? Is there a timescale to have some pilots at least on you know, up for discussion or
so we anticipate being able to say more in the coming months, and in particular the Farming and Food Production Group is proposing to report its recommendations in the summertime. So we should have something by then, and we may have some simpler things from the Simplification Task Force sooner than that, hopefully.
I mean, it's proposed, the proposal was that these pilots would be funded by a cap on individual farmers' payments, you know, an upper limit is one of the proposals. Is there any further information you can share on that proposal, that plan to cap payments?
So we set out in the simplification, the stability and simplicity consultation, what a proposed cap at certain levels would yield in terms of a sum of money. And we have not yet got that discussion on the responses to a stage where we're able to share our thinking with you yet. We haven't yet put decisions to ministers on that, so we're not yet there. But what I can say is that in the responses, there was a mixed set of responses to the consultation, with a cap actually being favoured by a good number of the responses, and a cap at 75,000 to over 100,000 being one of the sort of level that people thought was acceptable. So we have got some useful information to build our decisions on.
Okay, I've got another question. So it's about powers, and you know, I suppose it's similar to a lot of what Mike Rumbles was speaking about. And you know, in theory, the proposed conferral of powers on Scottish ministers allow the Scottish Government to implement a new system of agricultural support to replace the EU cap schemes after the end of the transition period through secondary legislation and without the need for further primary legislation. Now, we do know that secondary legislation allows much less scrutiny by the Parliament as to what's going on. So do you think that's a sensible way to go forward?
John.
So the cap schemes are set out and become part of the retained EU law within the UK, and what we're proposing here is to amend those regulations where those amendments may create a simplification or an improvement. So I think that is using secondary legislation to do that is the correct vehicle for a whole set of reasons, not least of which the timeliness and the efficacy of doing it in that way, in order that we can get the support to farmers quickly. So so yes, the answer to your question is yes. I think it is an appropriate way to do it.
I mean, it does mean that there's less chance for scrutiny of what's going forward. You accept that?
Well, so I think that's consummate with the level of changes that we would bring forward, though.
Richard, you wanted to come in briefly.
The question everybody always wants to ask is, how much money do we get for the EU for this, either through the UK or whatever, and how will it be funded in the future? Will it be funded by the UK or by Scotland?
Well, so the answer to that is that we're continuing to press the UK government to meet the commitments that were previously met by the European Union.
Many millions.
It's 500 million a year or so.
Right, so 500 million from the EU. So who's going to pay that 500 million after we leave the EU?
John, I'm sure you'd like to answer that. It may be more appropriate to let the Cabinet Secretary answer it when he comes in. I think it's more of a political nature than perhaps one to do with the bill team. So I maybe park your excitement at the opportunity to answer that and go to Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you. It may be for Mr Crawley. Just on the subject of scrutiny of legislation, be it primary, affirmative or negative, is it correct that it is entirely up to Parliament what the scrutiny process for any form of legislation is, and that the difference between the types is not related to scrutiny, it's related to the powers to amend?
I think yes. It's certainly up to Parliament to decide what level of scrutiny is appropriate.
Thank you.
I've just got a general question. Is farmers get payments through Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 payments through the current cap system? My understanding of the legislation would allow the Cabinet Secretary to shift everything from a Pillar 1 payment to a Pillar 2 payment without actually further consultation with the Parliament. Have I completely got that wrong, or is that what the legislation suggests? John?
One of the reasons that we need to take these powers is to allow us to do make changes such as the one that you're envisaging, although we've got no plans to do something as radical as that, and I don't think that would really count as a simplification or an improvement. Well, some people might see it as an improvement, but I think that would be contestable. So that is not what's proposed, and it certainly wouldn't be our intention to do that without bringing forward the powers.
Whether it's proposed or intentions, I was asking, does the legislation give you the ability to do that, should the Cabinet Secretary so wish? Well, it's a factual question, Mr Lyle. Is my understanding of the legislation is you can shift payments around under the current system from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 without further consultation allowed in the legislation. Is that a yes or no answer? Would be?
That would require parliamentary scrutiny.
Why would it? Where does it say that?
Well, so some of the processes that we are currently replacing by bringing the legislation into domestic law, some of the functions of the Commission are also being replaced. And one of the things that we have to do in order to make pillar-to-pillar transfers is notify the Commission of our intention to do that, and there are limits. So these are set out. So we would have to follow the required process within the European framework, having been retained. But I would look to Andy to tell me exactly where that was in the legislation, because There's
Well,
quite a lot of legislation, and I'm not familiar with the precise articles.
Maybe, John, we can part that and you can give me a specific lesson
Yeah.
afterwards so I understand it, because I don't see it at the moment.
Happy to do that.
And rather than take up any more time, Jamie Green, you've got the next question, I believe.
Thank you, Convener. I have to say I've listened to that first part of the session and I'm still a bit confused as to what this bill does and doesn't do, which I don't think is a great place for the committee to be in at the moment, but I'm hoping by the end of this section and future sessions we'll have more clarity, because it's still unclear. I mean, reading the Spice briefing, that, which I'm very grateful for, it says that Part 1 of the bill grants powers for Scottish ministers to, by regulation, make changes to any part of CAP legislation, make changes to the operation of financial provisions of CAP, and revoke or modify legislation on public intervention. That sounds like quite a lot. So I'm still at a bit of a loss as to whether this is simply a bill that enables Scottish ministers to continue to pay CAP under the current system, to continue to pay CAP under a new system and modify the current system, or to devise an entirely new subsidy system as a result of any policy decisions that it makes. I mean, can someone enlighten me as to where we'll end up if this bill passes?
Who'd like to lead on that? John, looks like you're...
Yeah, everyone's looking at me. So, so the purpose of the bill is to make improvements or simplifications to the retained EU law, which we will then have. But the CAP legislation is quite big and it does quite a lot of things. So it does things within the Pillar 1s of direct payments, and there are a number of schemes within that area of the Common Agricultural Policy, and it does quite a lot under Pillar 2. So from agri-environment schemes all the way to leader projects which benefit rural communities. So it's doing quite a lot of things already. So the scope of the powers within the bill would allow us to make improvements or simplifications to all of those schemes. So in one sense, that's quite a broad range of things that we can do, but we can only change them to the extent that they are an improvement or a simplification. So it doesn't go as far as your latter point of a wholesale change. So we're not proposing to get rid of Pillar 1 payments or get rid of Pillar 2, and we couldn't do that because that would be a wholesale change. What we're proposing is to allow us to make the necessary changes to the retained EU law to continue to function.
Right, so again, I come back to the premise of my original question, and that's if it's to allow something that currently exists to continue,
yes.
I understand and accept that. That's the technical need for Scottish ministers to have that power. If it's because Scottish ministers want to do something different from what's currently happened, and this bill enables them to do that, it doesn't specify the limitations of what those changes may be. The Cabinet Secretary told the committee that the bill was a technical bill designed to give powers to amend EU law in relation to the CAP, but the bill itself is not intended to make changes to existing policy. You've just said that it could enable changes to policy, quite substantial ones at that. Could you give me an idea of some of the changes that may want to be made as a result of the bill?
So the European Union member states already have discretion about which schemes they do and don't use within the different funding mechanisms. So, for example, in Scotland we use voluntary coupled support under Pillar 1. Other parts of the UK don't do that. So it's already in our gift within the European framework to choose to do that thing or not. And what extent to which we provide funding through that mechanism. And those are the sorts of things that this bill gives us the powers to amend in the way that we would do if we were a European Union member state or territory therein. Whereas the latter point that you make about wholesale change is not what is envisaged here.
It's not what is envisaged, but it is possible.
Well, it's not possible because it would, going to that extent, would go beyond the powers of the bill, which are to make improvements or simplifications.
I think some other members have questions on that, and again, those are quite vague terms that could be interpreted in different ways. But I want to ask another question, that's why has the Scottish Government chosen to go down this road of introducing this bill? What was wrong with the UK Agriculture Bill? Which deficiencies arose from that you felt were not addressed by that bill that meant that there needed to be Scotland-specific legislation passed through this Parliament? I'm quite keen to dig deeper on that.
Okay, I'll take that one.
Now, I will say, I kind of feel that is more of a question for Mr Ewing to answer, but if you'd like to start a wee bit on that and let him fill in the gaps when we see him, that's perfect.
That's fine. Certainly, I mean, I think as Vicky's opening statement set out, while there was an opportunity sincerely offered by our colleagues in DEFRA for the Scottish Government to participate in the UK Agriculture Bill, our view is that the appropriate place for legislation on devolved matters to be dealt with is here in the Scottish Parliament. There was nothing in the bill that's before us today that required Westminster intervention in any way, and therefore the prime place for that legislation should be here. As history has shown us, in fact, we end up now slightly ahead of the UK government as the UK Agriculture Bill has fallen, and at this stage we don't know at what time that would be reintroduced.
So this in no way addresses the issue of the fact that there is political disagreement between the two governments on a number of issues, and your way of dealing with that is to legislate.
The legislation that is in our bill, I think, as Vicky has already set out, is on a different set of issues. So it is not on the issues that were identified earlier in the session, where there is a disagreement between the UK and the Scottish Government. So on the World Trade Organisation provisions on producer organisations and fair dealing on supply chains, none of those provisions are in this bill. We sought to improve the provisions on those within the Westminster Bill. That was unsuccessful. Should that bill re-emerge, as we expect that it will, we will again be looking to make those provisions more suited to Scotland.
Jamie, I think you pushed that
Other members have questions.
As far as you can. I think we may go on to the next bit, which is Emma Harper. You've got some questions you want to ask.
Yep, thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. Just to pick up on supply chain and issues, and some of the issues around like dairy producer organisations, we've got fruit and veg supply chains, and the issues around how do we protect the producers over the big guys in the business, you know, when we're supporting milk contracts, for instance. So in, I think it's in section 6 of the bill, it's allowing producer organisations and associations of the producer organisations to be recognised under a given set of conditions, and organisations recognised in this way may be exempt from some provisions in the Competition Act. So I'm seeking just information about what extent will the bill cover areas that might be disputing between the Scottish Government and the UK Government, and how can we help support our producer organisations and make sure the supply chain is more stable.
George, I think that's you.
That is indeed me. So the provisions in section 6 of our bill relate simply to the fruit and veg producer organisation aid scheme, so not to the fundamental issues of the recognition or otherwise of producer organisations. That is an area that the United Kingdom government has asserted is reserved. We, as was set out in the legislative consent memorandum for the Agriculture Bill, do not agree with that position, and indeed over the last 20 years the practice has been for the recognition of those organisations to be, it was understood to be devolved, so it's been a slightly surprising change of stance by the UK government. But as things stand, the new legislation on recognition of producer organisations that the UK government has proposed will simply be in the UK bill, and the provision in section 6 is simply about the aid scheme. So the UK government does not dispute that the granting of aid to producer organisations is a devolved matter. Their assertion about the reserved status is more around the exemptions from competition law that producer organisation status grants. So there is a distinction between the two, and certainly I've had no indication that the UK government has any difficulty with the provision that is here.
So will the bill help promote, like, dairy producers? You know, we've seen there's volatility in milk market, and I'm going to mention the South Scotland region's got 48% of Scotland's dairies, and there's such a difficulty. We're finding that a lot of dairy farmers don't even have contracts that are that will help support them. So will this bill help support some of the producers in order to make their life a bit more stable, I suppose?
This bill will not, because in the UK government's view, this bill cannot, because they have taken the view that producer organisation recognition and the fair dealing and supply chain provisions under which the consultation that we've carried out with the UK government on dairy supply chains and mandatory contracts, in their view, could only be done using their legislation rather than anything in our bill.
Okay, thanks.
Just before we move on, do you believe that this bill allows the development of common frameworks across the United Kingdom and works hand in glove with all of the United Kingdom, or is it purely pushing towards Scotland?
The bill itself doesn't enable frameworks to be produced, nor does it get in the way of frameworks. Rather, the frameworks are a concept that's been developed under the auspices of the Joint Ministerial Committee between the administrations. Quite a bit of work was done in the early half of 2018 between the UK government and ourselves and Welsh and Northern Irish colleagues on the frameworks. That work has taken a little bit of a back seat lately because the concentration has been on the deficiencies fixing under the Withdrawal Act and on no deal preparations. However, we're meeting our colleagues next week, where we will reassess the position, looking at frameworks and all the work that needs to be done. In the meantime, there has been some work that has been done on what are called working level arrangements. So that is essentially the practical arrangements between the administrations and focusing on a no-deal scenario. So how in practice we make sure that the work between the administrations gets on. In some areas here, and so if I refer to the marketing standards provisions, for example, you could see them as an example of ensuring that there can be a UK-wide framework. So in the UK Agriculture Bill, provisions taken for England, Wales and Northern Ireland on marketing standards, the provisions that we have here would allow Scotland, if so desired, to keep in step with that, so that we could ensure a UK-wide set of arrangements.
Thank you very much, George. The next questions are from Stuart Stevenson. Stuart.
I'm going to just... I was going to ask it later, but marketing standards has come up. It's a tiny wee thing. Since marketing standards has come up, it covers at 8.2D labelling, and at 8.2J place of farming or origin. And I just wanted, it's just a technical question. I just wondered whether that allows us to insist that place of origin be placed on labels. Labels.
On labels.
Food labels.
Yes. 8.2 is, as you can see, quite a long list of provisions, all of which come directly from the existing European legislation. So, in a sense, while these are framed as new powers, they are really no broader than the existing EU powers. So, in some areas of marketing standards, there are requirements for country of origin labelling, in some areas less so. But in a sense, what 8.2 does give is a general power identical to the one that the European Union already has.
I don't want to go any further on that. It's just a technical question. We've covered a lot of ground on simplification and improvement, so I've really got one tiny little bit left, which we can deal with briefly, I think. And just, it would be helpful, I think, to the committee if we could have any early indication of simplifications or improvements that are currently in contemplation, either at official level or indeed when we have the Minister, we might ask him as well.
John.
So we've noted that your enthusiasm to get stuck in, and we're keen that you can do so. So we will take that away and hopefully bring something back as soon as we can.
Right. That I expected, in the light of previous discussion, that might be the answer. Right. In relation to LFAS, which is of course very important and distinctly different in Scotland, where 85% of our farming ground is less favoured. Does this indicate an intention to continue the current scheme for the duration of the transition period, or is it envisaged that there may be changes made to LFAS, and if so, when and of what character?
Thank you, Convener. So, Mr Ewing has already said, and I think he said it at the committee last week, I think, that we intend now to bring forward proposals to change the LFAS scheme. It's quite an old scheme and in some ways is quite outdated. So we are intending to start the process of bringing forward a new replacement for that. And in fact, that work has already started, and we are already engaging informally with some stakeholders on that matter, as Mr Ewing indicated previously. So the intention is to do that as quickly as we can.
So, given you're an official, I ask you, are you being directed towards development of new policy, or merely to improving the implementation of the existing policy?
So the main thrust of our approach on LFAS hitherto has been to use the European Union's areas of natural constraint approach, and that is the process under which we are still working, given that we do not yet know whether we're going to be in or out of Europe. So that's the basis under which the new scheme is being looked at. And in that sense, it is a new policy because it's the scheme has different rules and a different basis.
John Finney. John, you've got the next questions.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, panel, and thanks for your input. They substantially covered the areas there. Just very one small point, and it relates to Section 2 and the wide-ranging powers for secondary legislation. Now, that area has been very well covered, but can I ask how the views of the public, indeed stakeholders, would be taken on board with regard to any secondary legislation, accepting that it's for Parliament to determine how the bill is
Who'd like to lead off on that?
I'll take that. So, in terms of any new proposals, such as the one that we've just discussed on the LFAS, we would normally go through a process of engagement with stakeholders, and that level of engagement would be consummate with the size of the change that we would propose. And in terms of how we engage specifically with the interested parties, we have regular meetings with our key stakeholders at official level on a quarterly, at least, basis, and any proposals that we were bringing forward are done in that way.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, with some follow-ups here, Jamie Green, you wanted to come in, followed by Mike Rumbles.
Can I just clarify something? So, Section 2 of the bill that was referred to previously, changes to CAP legislation will be subject to regulation, I believe, under the negative procedure. Can you explain why that's the case and why it's not the positive, affirmative procedure, or indeed why it wouldn't be a separate piece of legislation that a committee, for example, would then do a full consultation on and take providence, and people would have the ability to amend and so on and so forth, given the importance of the future of CAP?
John, I guess that's you.
Yes, so the reason that we have indicated that they should be done by negative procedure is because we envisage that they are simplifications and improvements, so not major in nature. But of course, that's a matter for consideration. So that's our recommendation, given the magnitude of the change involved. But we stand ready to.
But I mean, if I'm a Scottish minister and I want to make sweeping changes to CAP in the future, how would I go about doing that? Would I use this piece of legislation, or would I need to introduce a new bill to Parliament? So
what we have stated is that this bill is only to make simplifications and improvements. So if we're wanting to make broader changes, then new primary legislation is envisaged, and that is what we've stated that we intend to do.
Thank you.
Mike Rumbles.
Looking at Section 2, subsection 1, from paragraph 1, the Scottish ministers may, by regulations, modify the main CAP legislation. Could you tell me, please, what the main CAP legislation is?
Yes, I can take that, Mr. Rumbles. If you look at Section 1.2, that defines the main CAP legislation, which is the list of the main European regulations which will become retained EU law. So it's the direct payments regulation, the rural development regulation, horizontal regulation. These are the basic acts. To put crudely, it's the European primary legislation, which is moving into national law if and when we leave the EU.
So, ministers may, by regulation, change primary legislation that we had through the EU. Is that what you're saying? You just said it relates to the primary legislation.
Well, it's not a like for like. They're basic acts, so they're the important pieces of EU legislation. But I suggest the point here, from our perspective at least, is the scope of the change that can be made. And coming back to what John was saying, it's simplification and modernisation.
Yeah, and my point is, though, that someone's modification is someone's change, and someone's simplification can be quite radical, can't it?
Well, that would be a point of view.
Well, it can be, can't it? You're not saying it can't be.
I'm not sure that I can answer that question.
Okay, well, I think Stuart wants to come in. Are you going to clarify it or ask?
Well, that's for others to say, Convener. Just looking at 3.1, it does seem clear, and I'd be happy to hear confirmation that I'm reading it correctly, that the modifications to the main cap legislation are constrained to secure the provisions of the legislation continuing to operate. That's it. It's not a total power to do all the things you may wish to do. And in 2.2, may only make modifications as we'd simplify or improve. Now, ultimately, of course, it's up to, I guess, the courts to decide what the intention is, and therefore it will be important that when we talk to the Minister, we seek clarity to get on the record. But it is not an untrammelled power. It is constrained both in 2.1 and 3.1. Is that correct reading of the bill? I'm getting a nod from Mr. Crawley. Thank you.
I'm not sure if that puts you on the bill team or back on the committee. But the next question, I think, is from Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Just staying with part one of the bill, what consultation has been done on the provisions in this bill relating to public intervention and private storage aid, aid to fruit and vegetable producers, the EU food promotion scheme, and marketing standards and carcass classifications, and what changes does the government intend to make in relation to these specific areas?
George, that is definitely you.
That's me. So most of these are of a piece with the wider stability and simplicity work. So as already noted, the provisions on the fruit and veg aid scheme, specifically refers to the simplification and improvement. So there hasn't been specific consultation on these. They were to some extent already covered by the wider stability and simplicity consultation. Marketing standards, however, is effectively, maybe as I mentioned earlier, a response to the provisions that the UK government included in their agriculture bill. And as we've set out, I think, in the policy memorandum, the risk that if those provisions proceeded for England, Wales and Northern Ireland, that Scotland could be left adrift, and therefore it was better to take a matching set of powers here so that we can, if the need arises, make similar changes to our marketing standards. There will, I should say, already be fairly wide-ranging powers under the retained EU law to make changes to marketing standards. So it's not that nothing can be changed in marketing standards. It's simply that the provisions here will allow us to keep pace with other parts of the UK.
Okay, could you give us a bit more clarification with regard to carcass classifications? I'm intrigued as to why that's included. Why would that have to change?
The carcass classification provisions are effectively a species of the marketing standards provisions in the EU Common Market Organisation legislation. Slightly different origin, so they were at the outset more intended about making sure that carcasses that were going into cold storage under the sort of public intervention scheme that ran in decades gone by were of an appropriate standard, whereas the rest of the marketing standards are more directed towards sort of the consumers and sort of retail sector. So essentially, you know, they're in the same basket as the rest of the marketing standards. I think in the UK government's bill, in fact, they're all dealt with in a single clause. We, for clarity, thought it was better to separate out marketing standards and carcass classification. There is, at this stage, no intention to actually make any changes to the carcass classification provisions. There have been in the past some suggestions by DEFRA that they might be interested in future at looking at a different scheme of carcass classification. The current systems are more about the confirmation of the animal rather than anything to do with what you might describe as the eating quality of the meat, and there has been some indication from DEFRA that they're interested in moving into that space. But at this stage, there is no proposal anywhere in the UK for changes on the carcass classification legislation.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
That is quite the most appalling thing that's ever happened to me in this committee. So I'm going to chastise myself for not following my own instructions at the beginning, and I apologise to all committee members present. May I hope it never happens to you. And to my wife, I say you shouldn't be ringing when you know I'm in a committee. So I apologise to everyone, and I'll talk to my wife later. Angus, back to you. I apologise profusely.
Well, if it does ever happen to me, I'll remind you of this situation.
Thanks, I'll speak to my wife.
Okay, if we could move on, under the previously proposed UK agricultural bill, the market intervention powers contained in the CMO regulation were proposed for abolition in England, Wales and Northern Ireland to be replaced with new powers available during, and I quote, exceptional market conditions. Now, the current bill allows market intervention provisions under the CMO regulation to be disapplied temporarily or permanently, or otherwise simplified or improved in Scotland. So does this indicate a fundamental difference in approach between Scotland and the rest of the UK? And if so, what's the rationale for that?
I don't think I would describe it as a fundamental difference of approach. We've already talked a little bit about the old days of market intervention. Many people in this room will be old enough to remember the days of the Butter Mountains and the wine lakes. Now those have largely gone. There is relatively little use of the public intervention private storage aid provisions at the moment. There's a little bit in relation to skimmed milk powder in Northern Ireland. The European Commission has recently opened an intervention scheme for olive oil, not something that affects us greatly in Scotland, but these provisions are far less regularly used. In fact, I'd probably go as far as saying they're only now used in relation to particular sort of market sort of crisis situations. So our colleagues in DEFRA have essentially decided that it's time to sort of draw a line under these schemes and to remove them. And so the provisions that they've taken in the previous agriculture bill, as you say, would allow the schemes to be done away with. We've taken an approach here that is more in keeping with the stability and simplicity approach. So we allow some simplification and improvement to the schemes, and the provisions to suspend the effects of the schemes would avoid the situation that some of the market intervention provisions are mandatory, so that if prices fall below a certain level, the scheme automatically kicks in. We wouldn't want to be in the situation where that happens in Scotland while the rest of the UK is not intervening in the same way. We could end up with one part of the UK trying to prop up the entire market of the whole of the UK. So the approach that we've got allows us to suspend the operation of these schemes the longer-term future, whether we retain anything like these, will be a matter for the longer-term policy work.
Okay, thank you.
Just before I go to Emma Harper, I just a question on the carcass classification. George, you know, and I know that every abattoir has a different slight permutation of the carcass classification as far as pricing is concerned. So they will set pricing, and some of them go much more in depth in carcass classification than other abattoirs. There's no intention here from the Scottish Government to change the way or to enforce every abattoir to go to a different form of, to a standard form of carcass classification, is there?
All abattoirs should be operating on the same carcass classification system.
Pricing and the sub-part of the pricing, sometimes they split them down further than the basic classification.
No, what will continue is essentially the EU ROP scheme. You want to be an E or a U. You don't want to be like me and be classified as a P. That scheme will remain in place. Now, how the individual abattoirs deploy that with their suppliers in terms of, how finally they set out their price schedule is a commercial matter for them. This bill would not affect that. And really, the scheme is there to ensure, going back to the question earlier about sort of fair play in the supply chain, to ensure a bit of rigour in there so that farmers are not getting a poor price and discover that their animal has been sort of downgraded without there really being any objective standard to look against. So it provides a bit of clarity and transparency in the arrangements.
Okay. Emma, yours is the next question.
Yep, it's just to kind of pick up again and clarify what following from Angus MacDonald's questions regarding the previous UK agricultural bill proposed to abolish the fruit and vegetables aid scheme in England, whereas the current bill enables the Scottish ministers to simplify, and you talk about simplification, which to me sounds positive. It enables the Scottish ministers to simplify and improve the ongoing operation of the scheme in Scotland. So is there a reason, can you clarify the difference from the UK approach versus the Scottish approach?
Yes, essentially, our approach is in line with going back to stability and simplicity. So we are not in here doing away with the fruit and veg aid scheme, and the intention would be that would continue to operate in Scotland during the next couple of years, pending the longer term policy work. I think across the UK it's around 40 million a year that goes into the fruit and veg aid scheme. Of that, about 4 million for Scottish producers. There will be some complications here in that many of the producer organisations actually have members in a number of different parts of the UK, and in fact some of them are transnational organisations with members in Spain, and the complications of that as part of Brexit still have to be fully worked through. But the immediate intention is not to do away with the fruit and veg aid scheme, which in our view has been a valuable way of supporting a sector that is generally unsupported in the CAP scheme.
Okay, and so in section 7 it gives the power to revoke the EU food promotion scheme. So the Scottish Government does intend to revoke the EU food promotion scheme, is that correct or not?
Yes, it is, and actually that is, we understand, an intention shared in other parts of the UK, or at least by DEFRA. The food promotion scheme is an EU-wide competitive scheme. Some Scottish bodies have benefited from it in the past. So QMS have participated in previous years. At the moment, the only UK participation is through the Northern Ireland Dairy Council, who have a couple of schemes about promoting dairy products, I think in the Middle East primarily. So there is no current benefit from that EU scheme. The scheme itself has been translated into domestic law under the deficiencies process. So we have now, or will have, legislation that would allow us to operate the scheme domestically. But essentially, we end up with what has previously been an EU-wide competitive scheme turning into a purely Scottish scheme. And essentially, it's rather too heavy duty for our needs. We already have existing powers, I think as noted in the policy memorandum, under the Quality Meat Scotland Order 2008, there's a power to make grants to Quality Meat Scotland, which we have already used, that could be used to achieve the same effect as this. There are also powers under the Agriculture Act 1993. So effectively, we've already got the simpler mechanisms by which we could achieve the same end as the EU scheme would provide, and therefore, essentially, it becomes redundant.
Okay, and the policy memorandum states that any decision to make changes to the marketing standards can be taken on a case-by-case basis regarding whether to follow any changes introduced in the UK Agricultural Bill or whether to retain alignment with EU law. So how is it envisaged that case-by-case approach to decision-making on this or other aspects of the bill will work in practice?
At the risk of repeating the question, it'll happen on a case-by-case basis. So we would need to look at, if we take the example that DEFRA proposes to change a particular bit of marketing standards legislation that would take it out of alignment with the European standards, that's the point that we would need to look at. Is it better for us, based on trade flows, for example, to maintain alignment within the UK so that the standards in England and Scotland are aligned, or is it better for us to retain alignment with the EU? At this stage, I'm aware of only one proposal from DEFRA for actual use of these powers, and that's in relation to hops and the frequency with which hops crops have to be inspected, and they're looking to reduce that. Now, that might be one where we are quite happy to fall in with DEFRA.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Jamie, you want to come in briefly?
Yeah, you talked about hops, crops, marketing standards. Can you just sort of define perhaps what a divergence in marketing standards on a practical level might actually look like? Because our understanding of food and drink and the standards around marketing are quite different. Is it the case, therefore, that this bill will allow Scottish ministers to look at changes that either the UK or the EU has made and decide which ones it prefers? Is that sort of what you're saying to us?
Essentially, yes. So if we ended up in a situation that there was divergence in standards because of decisions taken either at European level or by DEFRA, and that we're effectively in a situation where we have to decide which way to go on that, this would give us the flexibility to do it. Without these powers, and I think I mentioned earlier that there are already European powers to change marketing standards. We would be able to use those powers, but as the ones in the UK Agriculture Bill are a little bit broader, it is possible that a change could be made under the UK Agriculture Bill that Europe wouldn't be able to make, and that could lead to the sort of divergence. So it's in that sort of situation that we would be looking to, where's the balance of advantage for us to retain alignment with England or retain alignment with the EU.
Have you had any feedback from stakeholders about that potential divergence between standards and between Scotland and England?
There hasn't been any comment from stakeholders. I suppose it's worth as well remembering that a lot of the standards, certainly in the fruit and veg space, which is one of the main areas, are effectively developed at an even higher level than the EU. So the UN Economic Commission on Europe, UNICE, they set standards. So the most recent EU legislation on fruit and vegetable standards was actually moving the EU system into alignment with the new UNICE standards that kick in next month. So actually, while these look like very broad powers, most of the standards are developed at a supranational level.
Thank you. The next questions will be from the Deputy Convener, Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. We move on to collection and processing of data, and Section 12 of the bill gives Scottish ministers the power by regulations or under the affirmative procedure to amend the definition of agricultural activity. So my question would be, does the Scottish Government intend to change the definition of agricultural activity, and if so, to what?
Mr. Greener. I think the question that you're asking there is why do we have this power there? At the moment, no, we do not want to change anything that is defined. In fact, the legislation relates to the EU law definition of agriculture as it stands now. So the answer is no, we don't want to change it. But considering that we currently rely on the 1947 Agricultural Act, by having this power here, we're hoping to have the same longevity with this power in the Data Protection Act here.
Yeah, if you look at the definition of agricultural activity, it says production, rearing or growing of agricultural products, including harvesting, milking, breeding animals and keeping animals for farming purposes. I wonder if it's sufficiently clear or strong in terms of growing fruit and veg, for example. Do you think it is or not?
So what we are trying to do is be able to collect information from people who are producers of food, and I think that's all covered across all of these, the list of specifications here. I don't see there being anything that would not allow us to do that from fruit and veg producers, and I think I disagree with the point that we wouldn't be able to do that.
Okay. And can I ask, to what extent do the provisions of the bill relating to data collection and processing mirror the corresponding provisions contained in the UK Agriculture Bill as was, whether it comes back or not in the same form?
Yeah, okay, so we had discussions with DEFRA early on when they started discussing this, and we looked at what the focus of what they were trying to achieve with that bill was. The focus there, I think, was towards looking at animal welfare and plant health, which is covered by other legislation in Scotland. And the point that we thought was being missed was the fact that we've now got GDPR and the Data Protection Act, and under those legislations we need the legal basis to collect data, and we need to be able to specify that and be able to show the public and the farmers what that legislation is. This was an opportunity to clarify that, because at the moment it can be across a number of pieces of legislation or EU regulations. And so by bringing everything together into one place, it helps us focus and become more open and transparent about what data we can and cannot collect. And that's the focus here in our bill, and that was a very different focus in the UK bill.
And I suppose farmers will be wanting a reassurance that there is not going to be any more data collection, although sometimes they forget that we collect data because we're spending taxpayers' money on their subsidies. So can we have that reassurance?
Yes, you can have that reassurance.
Okay, thank you.
Stuart, you wanted to come in?
It's just a technical issue. At 16.4 A2, manage risks, including but not limited to and then it says climatic risks. I just wanted to be clear that that would include in particular the risks associated with climate change, especially in the light of the declaration of a climate emergency. It seems to me it would, but I'm just seeking clarity.
Yes, it would.
Thank you.
Just before we move on, the Deputy Convener asked you about changing the definition of agricultural activity. Could you just confirm if the definition of agricultural activity was changed by this as a result of this bill, what effect it would have on agricultural tenancies or planning legislation which relies on the current definition of agriculture as laid out? I mean, you've mentioned the Agricultural Act 1947, I think you did. So you've got various definitions. Is that going to be affected if you change it?
No, it wouldn't be affected, but I can go into a wee bit more detail there as well.
I'd be really happy rather than waste everyone's time on it,
no
because
problem.
it's quite a possibly geeky question, but I would quite like just confirmation that the definition for planning of agriculture and agricultural legislation will not be changed as a result of this, therefore affecting tenancies and planning legislation.
I mean, this is about collecting statistics and collected data from farmers for survey. We don't cover planning here, I don't think.
Andy and Ali, you can definitely write in and confirm if you'd like to do that, that it won't affect those two bits of legislation, because I think it's quite critically important that those legislation and the definitions of agriculture in there will not be affected by a change of agriculture definition in this Act. Angus, yours is the next question.
Yes, thanks, Convener. Just quickly, Convener, following on from Maureen Watt's questioning and thinking back to 2014-15 and Brian Pack's Doing Better initiative, which was an attempt to reduce red tape for farmers and land managers. Has there been an actual impact assessment undertaken to confirm that the data provisions of the bill will not impose any additional burdens on farmers, crofters and land managers?
No, we haven't done an impact assessment, and no, there won't be an additional burden. I can give that assurance here, because the purpose of this legislation is to define the legal basis upon which we're collecting data, and that's supposed to be open and transparent, so farmers could look at this and see exactly whether we're doing the job that we said that we would set out in this legislation. So it almost restricts what we can ask, so there would be no additional burden there. As statisticians, we also have the Statistics and Regulation Act, and within that we have the Code of Practice, and the UK Code of Practice puts upon us a duty to look at survey burden, and we're always looking to try and reduce that. So, for example, previously there used to be the sheep and goat inventory, and there would be the December census. Those two things are now combined together to reduce the burden. And going forward, the statisticians and my team are always looking at ways that we can combine questions together and reduce the time that it takes, and also looking at the sampling frames to look at sending out as few forms as we possibly can.
Okay, there'll be many farmers and crofters pleased to hear that, I'm sure.
Okay, and Colin, we've waited. I think you've waited patiently for your questions.
Absolutely, and very much on track with the reference to geeky questions you said, dear Convener. I've got one or two quite specific questions around the importance of data collection. The policy memorandum for the bill states that the Scottish Government does not intend to collect additional agricultural data. Now, given the rapidly changing policy environment that we face around climate change, around Brexit, has there been any discussions that there might be a need to collect different data in the future?
I'm quite happy to give geeky answers. I'm used to doing that a lot. The geeky answer to that is that yes, we do plan on collecting additional data, but not from farmers and not through survey. So, for example, one of the things that we're currently looking at, and I've got a team working on this just now, is using satellite data. And at that point, it gets very geeky, and it's data science that we're using to do that. It's IT specialists, mapping specialists, and statisticians working together to look at things like what crops we are growing across Scotland, and there's worldwide projects going on about that, and we collaborate with academics to look at what learning we can take and adopt that in-house. We aren't quite there yet, but the focus of doing that is that we can move away from doing the cereal harvest and therefore reduce the additional data that we might request from farmers in the future, and be able to use new technologies to do that ourselves.
Now, Section 13 and 14 of the bill allows the Scottish Government to, by regulation, impose requirements on persons carrying out agricultural activity or are connected with the agri-food supply chain, and the Delegated Powers Memorandum clarifies that this is intended to allow Scottish ministers to collect data from industry or supply chain subgroups. Can you tell us what those groups are at the moment, and is that likely to be any different from the groups that data is currently collected from?
No, so the point of the legislation, again, is to be more open and transparent. And as alluded to earlier, we've been using the 1947 Act, which specifies that we can ask for data from holdings. What we're actually doing with this legislation is actually stating who we are already collecting data from. So we're not collecting from anybody else. It's just restricting us, but also explicitly saying who we can collect data from. So, for example, we will ask for information from a number of suppliers, and we'll look at, back to the cereal harvest as well, we'll look at where does the cereal go after it leaves the farm gate. So it would be further down the supply chain there that we currently already look at, and we would just be repeating that. Again,
so it's just the existing groups, it's the status quo
existing groups, nobody new.
Okay. And the final point is the policy memorandum states that data collected is used to analyse economic output and performance effectiveness of policies and help Scotland provide information on the sustainable development goals. Can you elaborate a bit on the type of data that's collected for this purpose?
So there's a number of data collections. There's three main data collections that we have that we combine together to help do that. We've got the Farm Business Survey, which is between 400 and 500 farms, where we don't actually do, we contract that out to specialists who are used to auditing financial accounts, and we look at the information that we get from there, and that would help us look at the effectiveness of something like the CAP scheme. We don't ever get to see the individual record data, we get to see the analysis. We also have the December survey, which is going out now, the June census, which has already been out, and those look at certain points through the year, what agricultural production has been looking like, where we might see problems within the production, and we can alert policy colleagues if we do see anything in those trends. But those two surveys combined then are fed into what we call the total income from farming statistics, which is a combination of those surveys and a number of other minor surveys as well. Where we take all of that information and we estimate what GDP looks like for the sector, GVA, and we'll also look at productivity and other things there as well.
A couple of follow-up questions. Emma Harper, followed by Jamie Green.
Yep, thanks. It's just related to the definition of agricultural activity in relation to beekeepers. We've got hobby beekeepers, we've got about 25 bee farmers in Scotland. So is it including harvesting? Is that where beekeepers fall into the definition of agricultural activity?
That's quite a minor issue. So if it was all right with the convener, we might answer that question in writing later. I'm not aware of what data we currently collect from beekeepers and what we.
I'm sure it's helpful to write in. I mean, there is, as we all know, masses of data kept on even small holdings with chickens. They have to register chickens for avian flu and such like. So there are, I'm sure we'd welcome to know where our honey came from or the regulations to Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. Moving on from bees, can I ask a technical question around the collection of data and linked to the way in which CAP is paid? So at the moment, obviously, the criteria around how you define how much someone is paid and the level of subsidy is based on a certain input on the criteria that's used to work out the financial calculation. If the CAP policy were to change to use different parameters and therefore require different pieces of information from the farmer or indeed the landowner, would that or would that not be in conflict with the policy memorandum which states that as a result of the bill there would be no additional burden placed on farmers, crofters and land managers?
So I think there's this is about the legal basis. So the part two is about the legal basis for us going out and asking for information from survey, and we have to state that under GDPR, and that goes in the privacy notice, and we can point to the piece of legislation that says we are asking you for that data. if you are asking if a farmer wants to receive cap payments, that's a different piece of GDPR, so that would be consent, and so you would be consenting to give your information to receive the cap payments. So I don't think that's covered here. I think that I don't know if John wants to come in.
Maybe it's helpful. My point is that if this bill allows ministers to change the cap system by whichever means, and that is based on a different set of criteria to work out what the financial subsidy is, then inevitably that will require additional information to be given by farmers to the government.
So I think the level of information that we collect is at the whole sector level. So we're not collecting data for CAP. There's a clear firewall between what data is collected for CAP and what we collect. Right. And effectively, what you could have is a whole. You could devise a different system, and we would still be able to collect that data. And because that data is about the holistic goings on within the sector, we can then analyse that data to look at effectiveness of whatever policies this government or any other governments want to bring forward.
Rich Lyle, you get the last question.
I had the good fortune one time to go to one of the local offices and try on the equipment where the chap goes out and measures to the last inch or metre or whatever what the farmer hold. But we're still going to have to do that. We're still going to have to measure up what people have in order to equate their payments to that. Or can we get rid of that?
So,
to say that it's centimetres, not inches, but
well, indeed, yes.
So I'll still.
So at the moment, the requirement is
EU.
So the requirement is driven by the European Union legislation, and what is envisaged here is not a wholesale change. But one of the things that Mr Ewing and the stakeholders are very keen on is to reduce the impact of the burden of the legislation, if it's possible to do that, in particular where that burden is not producing a benefit to either the farmers themselves or the wider public.
So we're going to be able to minimise and reduce the red tape and the paperwork that you had to do, and the hoops that you had to go through. Some people say you're going to take back control. Are you really going to take back control?
So on that specific point about inspections and penalties, there's a very active stream of work that colleagues are working on for specifically that purpose. So yes, we hope to bring forward those minimisations of the impact of that on businesses and on us into delivery terms, so that we can do our work more efficiently on behalf of the sector too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that actually is all the questions that members appear to want to ask at this stage. So I'd like to thank all of the people that attended this morning. And I think there are some follow-up bits of information which the clerks will be in contact with you. I'd ask members, we're going to suspend the meeting for 5 minutes just to allow the witnesses to depart. And I'd ask you to be back here at 11:40, please. I suspend the meeting. I'd like to welcome everyone back to this meeting of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee and move on to agenda item 3, which is the European Union Withdrawal Act. This is the SIFT of one EU exit instrument as detailed on the agenda. The Scottish Government has allocated the negative procedure to this SSI. Is the committee agreed that it is content with the parliamentary procedure allocated to this instrument by the Government? Agreed. We are agreed. Thank you. We'll then move on to agenda item 4, which is subordinate legislation. This is the consideration of 2 negative instruments as detailed on the agenda. I would remind the committee that no motions to annul or representations have been received in relation to these instruments. Do any members of the committee have any comments on either of these instruments? Mike.
Thanks, Convener. I do notice that on the... Sorry.
Microphone. Sorry, just 2 seconds. There we go. You're off.
Right.
Yep,
okay.
you're off.
I do notice that the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, when they looked at the fishing boats designation order, found 2 errors in it relating to the area in Schedule 1 of the Republic of Ireland and the Netherlands and Norway. And I do also notice that the Scottish Government have committed to correct both of these errors before the instrument comes into force. So I don't want to delay this at all. What I would ask if the committee could ask the government just to write to us and just say that confirm that they have done this, because I think that's an important part of our role.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just looking around the committee. There seems to be general nods that it seems to be in order to write to the Scottish Government noting that we've noticed that they require some work and ask them to confirm to the committee that we're doing that. On that basis, are you happy that we respond to the instruments with that recommendation? Thank you. We're now going to go into private session.